Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. How are you, Rochelle?
I'm good. How are you, my dear?
I'm good, hanging in here.
Yeah.
Still trying to get used to this work from home flow, but it's going well.
Well, you look beautiful as always.
Thank you.
Do I get to call you Vonde anymore? Or are you more national now? You're not international?
Just taking a break. I'll be international again in October if my trip doesn't get canceled.
Where are you going?
I'm supposed to be going to Antigua. It's an annual trip. They've already had to scale some things back, so at the moment the trip is still on, so we'll see what happens.
Make sure you bring the money back with you. You know I collect that money from all those weird places. Make sure
Oh,
you send me
gotcha.
mine.
Or I'll remember. I'll remember.
Okay, good. So tell us a little bit about you. Help us get to know you a little bit.
So I'm from Mount Vernon, New York, which is a pretty small city right above the Bronx. It's only 4 square miles. So I was born and raised here. I've been in private school my whole life. So I went to one in Mount Vernon, but after that, I've gone to a couple more northern Westchester. Um, they're they're all predominantly white schools. So I'm used to being in areas where I'm one of the only Black people, if not the only Black person. After high school, I went to Cornell University for undergrad, so still in New York, but upstate, another PWI, of course. Took 1 year off before law school, and then I headed down to Duke for law school. Went in blind, never even visited the campus or the state, but worked out.
So why did you go to private school? Was there something different about the New York education systems between public and private?
My mom just preferred the private school system. She is an immigrant. She came here from Jamaica when she was about 9. And so my grandparents actually left their 4 kids in Jamaica for about 2 years and came up here to get themselves settled and work. So, from my mom's perspective, education is the key and the answer to her success. Even out of all her siblings, she kind of got the highest in her educational career, and she ended up being the most successful in that respect. So for her, I just think that's a link that she sees, and that's it's debatable, private school versus public school and the value you can get for them. But I know that's how she sees things. So it was really important for her to put me in private schools where she felt I could get the best education.
And what was it like to be a Black person in a predominantly white school almost through your entire academic career?
Uh, you know, Elementary school and middle school, I think I didn't necessarily notice it as much. In high school, I don't know what happened with my admissions year. My class had about 9 Black students. I think 6 Black girls, 3 Black boys, and the class above me had 10 Black students. But we those 2 classes were outliers. So most of the other classes in the school, and it's a K through 12 school, most had between 1 and 3 Black students. So for my class, it was really nice that I was able to actually have more Black people to hang out with.
Mhm.
And to this day, those are still my best friends. I started at that school in 7th grade, and there was a group of 4 of us Black girls who just kind of stuck together, and that's who I still spend all my free time with. Um, but we definitely experienced, microaggressions, and when a new dance would come out, everyone would come up to us and be like, "Oh, hey guys, did you hear about this new dance? Can you show it to us?" And things like that. But then, no one was inviting us to like their parties that we were having, or we knew that when it came time for prom, no one was going to ask us to prom, and we all had to bring guys we knew from outside of school. So, just kinds of things like that. We noticed them, and we never necessarily talked about them at the time, but we know that they kind of affected how we kind of viewed the kind of environments we wanted to be in, people we wanted to be around, and things like that.
Mm. And so, where did you go for undergrad? You said Cornell.
Yeah.
What was that like?
It was interesting. So after dealing with the high school I went to and just kind of seeing how people otherized us, like I'm not the type of person who goes through that experience and says, okay, I need to do X, Y, and Z in order to make myself fit in, to get in with these people. I more so will retreat and say, you know what, you don't want me around. I don't want to be around you either. So at Cornell, there are a few different program houses, and One of them is Ujima, which is geared toward the African and African diaspora community. So, and my mom went to Cornell also, so I already knew about the Ujima dorm. So I applied to live in there my freshman year. I lived in there, so it was mostly Black students. There were a couple non-Black students in there, and I pretty much kind of was in environments where I was able to meet a lot of Black people, and there was Students United, which is an umbrella organization which does covers African American and like Caribbean student organizations, African student organizations, and just always events going on. There were always things going on from like D9 organizations. So I ended up spending most of my time kind of being around people who looked like me. Not because I necessarily felt like I missed it, but because I knew I just wouldn't have to deal with certain things that I had to deal with in high school and middle school, being in PWIs my whole life.
Yeah. And so that was a good experience, your 4 years at Cornell.
Um, in general, because I tended to put myself around people who I knew had similar values and ideals. Um, there were times where things weren't necessarily the greatest. I remember maybe freshman year and sophomore year, there were a couple times that my friends and I tried to like go to fraternity parties, and we at the door we'd get stopped. Do you know anyone here? Do you go to school here? So after that happened, like maybe the second time, my friends and I said, you know what, we don't need to do this anymore. There are other parties we can go to, and we just kind of removed ourselves from having to deal with that.
Okay. And so now you're at Duke Law. You're going to be a lawyer.
Yeah.
Describe that experience and what happened while you were at Duke.
Um, Duke Duke was different for me because it's so much smaller than being at Cornell. It's a very tight knit community. There were only I think about 220 of us, and then 18 Black students. So I had a similar experience in terms of like finding my group of students to hang out with, being around people who looked like me, people who listened to a similar kind of music as I did. So from that perspective, I think it was good to like be able to find a group of people who we meshed as well as we did.
Yeah. And so with your background and what you've experienced, how has that shaped you for the workforce? How has that shaped how you see the world, all your experiences in education? What have they how have they shaped your philosophy, if you will?
Honestly, I think it's still changing. I was speaking with my cousin about this actually about a week ago, and it's something I didn't necessarily realize, but I think that because of my background and the educational institutions I've been to, I suppose people will look at my resume, for example, and say, oh, okay, she's one of the good ones, things like that. People tend to be very impressed when I tell them that I went to Cornell. My internships have tended to be pretty like more high caliber. So I think in terms of blending in, it's not necessarily difficult for me. I've been navigating spaces like this my whole life, and I don't think it was as difficult for me as I know it was for some other people who haven't necessarily been in PWIs for as long as I have.
So what type of law will you practice or are you practicing?
I'm practicing securities law, which I know everyone doesn't necessarily understand what securities are, but I basically say it's in like a niche area in corporate law.
And how has that been? So what is it like to be a Black lawyer in securities?
So, funny enough, I was thinking recently that I never have really experienced imposter syndrome, and I felt it for the first time since starting work at my firm in October. I don't feel as though I'm treated differently from, partners or associates in my group or at the firm, but I have had a few times where, I may have messed something up or I may have not gotten it on the first try like it would have. And now I'm looking around like, okay, am I going to get this? Am I going to get to the point where of experience that everyone else has? Are they looking at me like, oh, see, I knew she wouldn't get it. So this is the first time that I really have kind of had those thoughts, and I've never had that in any of my schooling, whether it was Cornell or Duke or beforehand.
So how have you addressed that? Because you know you have nothing to worry about. You know you're brilliant, right? You do know that.
Thank you. Honestly, I'm still working on it, and I haven't really talked through it with anyone. When I think about things like that, I try to just, cut myself off and remind myself that I will figure it out. But it's difficult, especially kind of just being stuck at home, and I can't pop my head into anyone's office and ask for clarification. And sometimes I end up spinning my wheels, like reading an email, wondering why it's taking me so long and it's not clicking. So it's been an interesting process, especially as a first year associate, just being away from everyone for so long.
So where do you see your career going? Is this where you plan to work your entire legal career, or do you have other things that you want to do? And how does that look, in the overall society? Like, so what are the things that you need to have happen for you to do well and to achieve whatever your goals are?
So to answer that, I'll back up a little bit. I always knew I wanted to go to law school, but my junior year in college, I did a semester in DC called Cornell in Washington, and the program was entirely public policy focused.
Mhm.
While I was there, I had to do an internship, so I interned with the Children's Defense Fund, which is Marion Wright Edelman's organization in DC, and I was working on health and education policy. So I kind of discovered my passion that semester, and my plan going forward was to do a dual degree JD MPP program at whichever law school I chose. So I ended up not doing the MPP. I spoke with a few people once I started at law school who suggested, that it wasn't necessary to get the master's concurrently with the JD. Like if I got the master's first, it would make sense, but not to bother. So my passion still is to end up doing some policy work at some point in life. And I was originally planning on being in DC so I could kind of get involved with the public policy world. So my plan is still to try to, work with health and education policy because they're very important, but they're also linked together. Kids need to learn, they need to go through schooling. However, how much are they going to learn and retain if they're hungry because they haven't eaten in 2 days? So things like
Absolutely. Makes very, very good sense. So, have you watched the video of Mr. Floyd's death?
nope, I don't watch any of the killing videos. I haven't. I'm not. Those things just really stick with me. In general, I am not really supportive of the idea of how desensitized we've been to killings in general, but also just to watching Black bodies lying there and watching the life being taken from Black people. I don't I don't like it. And I think people are at different parts of the spectrum and what they need to see to get to a point where they're motivated to do something, right? So for some people, I think they see videos like that and it's the first time they've had to come to terms with the fact that these things happen. For me, you know, I majored in Africana studies while I was at Cornell. My family has never really hid things like that from me, so I'm already at a point where I know these type of injustices occur against us, and it's just not necessary for me to see it to be reminded that these things are happening and something needs to be done. So I never watch them. If I see it on my feed, I keep scrolling. If it's on TV, I turn the channel. Yeah.
So, why do you think his death has sparked so much uprising, if you will, people feeling some kind of way about this? Because, as you said, this is not new. This is just one of many. So why do you think this has momentum and has now?
So even though I personally feel like in a lot of these cases, there's tons of room to argue, you know, it seems like this is the most clear cut video we've seen, just in terms of everyone really being able to look at it and say, okay, that was too much. He didn't do anything.
Mhm.
In other cases, people have room, and not that I agree with it, but people have room to say, okay, well, this person instigated by doing XYZ. They genuinely could have invoked fear by doing XYZ. And I think it was just very clear in this video that he was lying there peacefully. Another thing I've been thinking about is, you know, I've personally never shot a gun or anything, but it seems that just the level of involvement to hold a gun and shoot it, whether you're from feet away, yards away, or whatever, I think is different from having skin to skin contact with someone and choking the life out of them in that way. I think it just requires a very different mindset that maybe it might be easier and seem less personal to shoot a gun from a certain distance, which I don't think that's the case, to be able to kneel on someone and force the breath out of someone for that long.
So I think you said you saw what you need to see, even if you didn't see it, you knew what happened to Mr. Floyd. So as a Black woman, a young Black woman, where do you see change? What are the things? So you talked a little bit about policy work. You know, you work in law, so there's lots of opportunities to change what we have. But as you know, the Supreme Court has been dangling on becoming a very conservative Supreme Court, undoing some of the civil rights and voting rights legislation. Where do you see law going that may make it possible for Black and brown people to finally be seen as equal or human?
So unfortunately, I'm a bit pessimistic just based on everything I have studied up until this point, and just kind of, I feel like the system needs such a kind of a deep cleaning, if you will. I think what is really important is just kind of seeing people of in my generation and around this age group getting more involved and just giving this more of an importance and deciding to run for their local office, and run for the Senate, Congress, and all those things. I think that's going to be a major changing point, and so I think it will take a while. But I think what is really needed is, to get out all the people who have been in the Congress for 30 years and they're now in their 80s, still making the same decisions that they were making 30 years ago. So I think we just need a whole fresh start of all the people who are involved in these systems so that we can talk about things and rework them and revamp them.
Yeah. So, as many times as I've spent time with you, I know that you are absolutely a brilliant young woman. What does the world hold for you? What's the gift you give to the world and the world gives to you for what you bring to it?
I cannot answer what the world is giving to me, but I do have plans. Like I said, I'm passionate about health and education policy. My ultimate goal is to start a nonprofit. I want to be able to do something that is helping my people. So I would like to have an organization that kind of focuses on all things that kind of has served as roadblocks to the Black community for years, decades, possibly even centuries. I want to address health disparities and education. At the end of the day, I understand that none of these things exist in a vacuum. Um, if you start a kid off from a place of being in poverty because their parents weren't able to buy a house because of redlining, et cetera, these kinds of things are going to continue. So how do we address that? How do we get to a place where kids are able to have an education and they can see the possibilities of careers that they can have, and just want to address everything. So
That makes sense. So, in terms of education, um, oftentimes we think about education in the post-secondary level, but truly success in education has to happen in elementary education. I mean, you have to start very young. Why do you think it's been disproportionately negative, for lack of a better word, for Black and brown people? Why do you think the education system is the way it is?
in what ways?
So a lot of Black and brown kids go into a public school system and they bring with them whatever's happening at home, their behaviors, their thoughts, their ideas, their socialization, all of that happens in school. And then at some point along the way, they check out, right? So their school is not, is engaging no more than a place to go see your friends or go hang out, right? It's not a place where you're seeing how you can better yourself. What leads to that, and what do we do to change that?
Well, I think it's a lot of things. I know you mentioned kids kind of bringing in whatever baggage they have in their personal life into school. I think one of the things to address there is mental health. I think there are various communities that struggle with kind of the stigma around mental health and talking about it and addressing it, but it does also exist within the Black community, and I think a lot of people tend to not realize the importance of therapy. And it's not even necessarily a person to prescribe what problems are, but it really can be helpful just to talk through ideas and figure out what the problems are and ways to address it, maybe ways to adjust your own behavior and your responses to certain things that happen. So I think that's one part of it. Of course, the distribution of resources has been very, very unequal going back since we were allowed to even be in schools. So that, of course, absolutely needs to change. I actually have a cousin who is a teacher in Queens, in New York, and she was telling me about how difficult it's kind of been to her to get parents on board for advocating for their own children just because they're so busy at work. She'll reach out and she knows that these people obviously love their children and want what's best for them, but they just simply don't have time to kind of go head to head with the school board and whoever they need to speak with to get the resources and make sure their kids are getting what they need in school. So it's such a deep rooted problem, and I don't think there's just one solution. I really think that there need to be various solutions going on simultaneously in various different areas so that we can kind of just fix everything from the inside.
So, what's the difference between systematic and institutional racism?
Um, so, I mean, I tend to use them in a similar way. Um, I'm not I can't speak to exactly what the difference is, but I tend to use them more or less interchangeably, just from the standpoint that, there are systems that have been in place, laws and policies that are in place, holding people back from, even though schools have been integrated, there's still de facto segregation in lots of areas, even within Durham. You have one side of a highway with primarily African American communities and families, and then the resources are underfunded. And then on the other side, you have Caucasian American families and homes, and they get different resources. So just things like that, where um, people are kind of looking at laws generally that have passed, but then they won't look at what the actual effects of things that have been passed and what further needs to be done. They kind of, just stop at the basics.
Mm. And maybe in my mind a little bit different. Like institutional means that there are policies and cultures that exist in organizations that are rarely reviewed or look for ways to make them better. And then systematically is where, this is the system, this is, so when you hear the word the American dream or the American people or the all-American girl or the all-American boy, those code words to me applies more to the system. The system is built for us not to be included in those things. So you talked about redlining, and there's that. We have now gentrification. We have all these things that are happening around us. So to me, institutional is like within an organization or within higher education or even elementary education, there are these practices that are at least maligned against Black people and maybe intentionally detrimental to Black people, whereas systematic, these are systems that have just been built on each other over and over and over time, and so we have what we have. When I talked with Melanie a couple, 3 weeks ago, I don't remember when it was right now, she talked about slave patrols and like, do you want to defund the police, and so a lot of people have been talking about that. What are your thoughts about that, defunding the police?
I think it's a great idea. I think a lot of people don't necessarily understand it. People also tend to fear what they don't understand. So for people who have grown up with police being the main or even the only source of, conflict resolution, that can seem like a scary thing. But I think the important aspect of it is finding alternatives. So it doesn't mean getting rid of police and having everything be a free for all. It really is about investing in other parts of community development. You know, making sure there are mental health professionals that can respond to mental health crises, for example. Um, Even having, for example, I don't know if you heard about the lady in Valley Stream, New York, who has just been terrorized by her neighbors.
Yeah.
They've been throwing all kinds of things into her yard, walking around with guns. And the police actually would not do anything because they said they were waiting. There was nothing they could do until or unless she was physically harmed. And so people from all over New York have been camping out outside her house. So just those kinds of things, being able to kind of having community resources that can come together and that people can rely on in place of having a police force. I think all it would take really was dedication, commitment to figuring out the alternatives rather than shutting it down and say, no, it won't work.
Yeah, I think I agree with you. So in my mind, defund the police, I'm not so sure I understand what that means. If it means take money away from police so that they don't have all the resources they need to do whatever it is they've been designated to do, I don't think I'm in favor of that. What I think defund the police means, instead of giving them all that money for whatever it is that they get, so if they get a squad car, if they get new technology, that they also get a person, like so a social worker rides with them so that they can identify these issues or help de-escalate the issue, that there are people there who are more in line with the entire problem in the community. So if someone calls the police and says, hey, someone's trying to kick in my door, I think that should be a police response. But if someone says, my husband and I are fighting, and you bring the social worker to that conversation so that neither person is shot or killed or whatever. And so I think defunding the police really needs to be further extrapolated, pull it apart some more to see what that really means. Because I think the way it's being told, I don't know if you've seen the latest political commercials, but the way they say, well, you call 911 and the person says, we're not available for 5 days. I think that's fear mongering, right? So to make people afraid, and then people get to the place where they're, okay, we've got to keep this person because this person is going to make sure I'm safe, So I think that people really need to clarify what they mean by defund the police so that it doesn't overtake this election, because right now that's really a pinpoint for this election, is to say, okay, this person wants to defund the police. Am I going to be safe anymore? Or it's driving people out to buy more guns, right? So, there are all these little things that people make up about something. So it's a story that fits the narrative that's being portrayed out there.
Right. And I don't want to speak for everyone because I know that I have heard people who would prefer to just abolish the police. And like you were saying, it derives from slave patrols. And what did people do before slave patrols? There clearly was a system before that. So, yeah, but like you were saying, personally, I think it's more about redistributing resources. You know, do the police need to have tanks and all this riot gear when they're coming to protest? Can we cut back on those gear and have them with the basic necessities that they need, but then redistribute some of that money so that we can give people more than a one-time $1,200 payment so people can feed themselves, and give money to educational programs and arts programs. Poverty also can be linked to crime because of crimes of opportunity. Um, Obviously it's not right, but if you have a bunch of communities where people are disenfranchised, people don't have work because there's no access to work, they're hungry after a certain point, and they may not feel like there is necessarily a lot to live for. They may not have examples in front of them of what more there is. It becomes a point of survival. What else would happen? So they're not inherently evil people, but give them a way to sustain themselves and a way to better themselves and give them the resources they need. And I'm sure you would see a turnaround. So things like that.
Yeah. So I heard you say earlier you were pessimistic, but are you hopeful that this particular time space and time that there will be some substantive change, or are you thinking that this is just going to be another protest and after a while it'll die down and we'll go back to the status quo?
I'm hopeful, but it depends on how much pressure we continue putting on our governments. A lot of people have been talking about how the protests are actually still going on, but the media has stopped covering them. So just those kinds of things, I have no idea if the size of the protests have decreased. I know they're still happening. I don't know if the media stopped covering them because they've gone down from, 10,000 people to 5,000. Those types of details, I'm not sure. So I think it really just is up to us to make sure that we don't stop demanding these things. And from what I've seen so far, it's worked in certain cities. I know certain cities, have decided to have looked at reviewing their no-knock warrant policies, for example, after Breonna Taylor's death. I know certain cities have started looking into defunding their police forces or at least redistributing them and having databases or other mechanisms to review former police misconduct. So far, I think that it has proved that it's working, but I really just think that we have to keep it up. And in addition to all those things, also voting, but I don't think either one of them is the end all be all.
Okay. So I'm sure you've also heard there's been talk about reparations. What are your thoughts about that? I mean, do you think that will happen? And if so, what should be the criteria for reparations?
Well, here I'm being a pessimist again. Unfortunately, I don't think it's going to happen, but I absolutely support it. And even in speaking of criteria, I think it's funny because, um, my lineage is not from here. Both sides of my family are Jamaican. I'm a first generation American, so I don't think I would be qualified for any reparations based on slavery in the United States, but it absolutely something that's necessary. I'm not sure why people are so unable to see the how those kinds of effects have been perpetuated through generations. But yeah, just even when you look at things like the disparity between wealth in Black families versus white families today, it's it's very jarring. Um, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so my last question, and then I'll give you the remainder of the time. So there's been an ongoing discussion about all lives matter versus Black Lives Matter. What are your thoughts about that?
Um, I go back and forth between trying to decide if people are just too unintelligent to understand Black Lives Matter or if they're just evil and don't care. I think both of those things may exist. Um, the way I see it, Black Lives Matter means Black Lives Matter too. And so I think for people in both spectrums, we're reading in an additional word. The way it's actually meant is Black Lives Matter, and we added two at the end. And the way that the All Lives Matter people read it is they added an only at the beginning, which just isn't correct.
That's brilliant. That's absolutely brilliant. I think that's the clearest explanation I've heard yet. That is absolutely brilliant because I think that's exactly the case. My normal analogy is, you call the fire department because there's a house on fire down the street. The fire truck gets on the street and starts pouring water on all the houses that are not on fire, and they let the house that's on fire burn to the ground. And to me, when I think about that, I think that how can you not see what's happened to Black and brown people for hundreds and hundreds of years, indigenous people for hundreds and hundreds of years? So we're taking down statues, we're renaming sports teams and all of these things. What has that got to do with what you have done to these people for so long? I mean, to be angry because we're taking a part of their history, so that means our history doesn't matter because your history matters. So that's all. Okay, you the rest.
I didn't realize that, of course, there are deficiencies in our education system, but it's come to my attention in recent years that slavery really just isn't even represented accurately. So for some of these people, which is crazy to say, I think they actually are not aware of how just atrocious and inhumane the American chattel slavery system was. I've seen pictures of textbooks from elementary school just describing slavery as like they were farming, things like that. So it's hard to convince people of how much damage has been done when they don't even understand what the action was initially.
I think that's absolutely correct. So you have 5 minutes, all yours, whatever you wish to say.
Oh man, on the spot. I have one actually anecdote that I want to share, which I that conversation reminded me of from high school. So Malcolm X's daughter, Eliasa Shabazz, graduated from my high school. And she came in to speak, I think, my junior year of high school for our Black History Month programming for the year in our auditorium. And she started out by, just kind of trying to get a sense from the room of the types of information we had encountered on Black history. And the only specific question I remember her asking about was, had anyone ever heard of the Haitian Revolution
Amen.
in Haiti?
Yep.
And just about no one raised their hands.
Yep.
And I had never heard of it. And I was 16 at the time. And after that class, I went to my English class, and this is high school, so we had our classes for the entire academic year, September through June. And I'm quiet. Anyone who's been in classes with me knows I'm not one to volunteer to speak in classes. There was a student in my English class. There were about 11 or 12 of us. And so our teacher asked us how we enjoyed the conference, and the student was just complaining about how Miss Shabazz made it seem like he didn't know anything, or made it seem like we weren't being taught and we didn't know what was going on. And I was so upset because I knew that from his perspective, he was mad that a Black woman came in there and knew more and made it clear that she knew more than everyone. And that was just kind of the moment where I got mad about everything I had learned and not learned up to that point. And that was kind of when I decided that I wanted to major in Africana Studies once I got to college, and make sure that I could at least try to make up for all those things I never learned about.
Because of course, Christopher Columbus discovered America.
Obviously, there was no one who found it.
No one was here when he got here. He was the first one. We got Florida, Ponce de Leon, and all that stuff. That was it. Or like, I think that your point is so great, because like, I think the school system stopped teaching the history because history was not favorable to them. Right? So if I can teach, American history, there was a civil war, and the war between the states was between the North and the South, not what the war was about. Where civil war is about slavery, and simply slavery, and whites wanted to continue to keep slaves and to make profits off of their backs. But we're not going to teach that. We're not going to teach what happened to the indigenous people who had been living off this land for thousands of years, and being at peace with the world, and the world at peace with them, and to the point that they're basically eradicated and pushed off to, these areas where they have high prevalence of alcoholism, low education, and all that stuff. None of that matters, because all the world needs to have is the world from this lens. And this lens says this is what the world is. And unfortunately, that's not what the world is. And going back to my question about education, like, I think that when we do develop an education system that is intentionally equal, not unintentionally unequal, right? Because, white women are quite capable of teaching and teaching people of other races, but I'm talking about intentionally equal, where we teach our entire history, not just the parts that sound good or make some groups feel better about themselves than others.
Absolutely.
Yep. Well, it is so wonderful to see your beautiful face, and I know you're going to go back to being Vondae pretty soon, jet setting across the world, don't let your feet hit the ground. So I'm looking forward to hear about all those your expositions and travel. So please keep me posted. I love you very much. I miss you very much.
I'll come visit as soon as the pandemic is over.
I appreciate that very much. Bryant told me he was coming to see me in September, so I got that. Melanie said she was coming to see me. Jabril came to see me in the middle of the pandemic, but I was sick, so he Skip saw him, but I did not get to see him, so I missed him. But I will get to see him again, I'm sure, soon. But I hope you all stay in touch with each other and continue to support each other, because I think you got through law school with each other, being there for each other all the time. And I hope, although now you're in your careers and got other pressures, I hope that you you stay in touch. And don't forget to stay in touch with me. So
I would never forget to stay in touch with you.
I appreciate that so much. It's very good to know. And please tell your mom I said hello. And I want to see her too. So when you come, bring her with you so, you know, we can eat again. But thank you so much for doing this for me. And
I'm glad you're doing this. It's
I feel like
needed.
it's the right thing to do. I just don't know, you know, where, like when I did it, after I saw Mr. Floyd's death, I saw all these important people on television talking about it, but the people who were actually down here living this didn't have a place. So that's why I started doing this. And it's been very hard because your heart breaks every time you have one. You know, your anxiety levels go up, but at least the stories are out there. Maybe somebody will see them and they will matter and they will result in change. And that's what my hope is. So thank you so much, my darling. As soon as the video converts, I will send you a link and you can say, yes, you can upload it. Nope, or we can do it over. Okay.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.